Years ago, I took a class at UCI that spent a lot of time on the Tudors. The Tudors are fascinating. And so I'm going to talk about Henry VIII and the art that's related to it. This is an art history course, and sometimes people don't hear the word history. So we're going to have a little bit of both art and history. And going to basically go through the wives of King Henry VIII and a little bit of the story. Certainly not all of it. It's rather convoluted, but I thought I'd hit some of the key points. So, King Henry VIII, uh, I think we all wonder about him. We wonder about him because, of course, how he dealt with his many wives, six. It was always interesting. So, in any case, there's a picture we have of him, this very, very big, bold man. In actuality, when he was quite young, he was quite handsome. He was known to be quite handsome. Would we know about King Henry VIII if not for all of his wives? According to most scholars, he's not one of the overly important rulers, but because of that particular story, or those particular stories, I should say, he certainly has been of more interest. So 1491 to 1547, lived to be 55 years old. That was not particularly young in that day and time for people to pass away, and he had a number of health problems. It's a little bit of a mystery of what indeed ailed him, but I think we've been able to connect the dots more or less, but I'll get there. So here's an early portrait of King Henry VIII, one that you're probably not overly familiar with. When I think of portraits of King Henry VIII, I think of jewel tones, lots and lots of burgundies, dark green, lots of golds, lavish. He loved to dress. He loved fancy jewels. He had somebody who, of course, more than one person who would actually help him dress. And so it was really, really no doubt of his importance. You have the brooch on the hat, and you have the bands of jewels across, and then you have the velvet mantle. I mean, you can't miss that this is important. This is an important man. So there's the most of the picture and then a detail of the picture so you can kind of see it close up. So unknown artist. This is a time period that artists didn't always sign their work. They were more or less considered artisans or craftspeople. In most cases, there were a few very important painters, court painters, that were well known. So the idea of the artist was still developing. So again, we don't picture him looking rather handsome, but he was. And he was quite the sportsman, known to be fantastic on a horse, really enjoyed hunting, very, very active man. So he was considered cultured, athletic, had a good reputation until he started chopping their heads off. But before then, he did. So, considered the beginning of the English Renaissance and Reformation. Father of Mary I, born 1516. Her mother was Catherine of Aragon. Father of Queen Elizabeth through his second wife, Queen Anne Boleyn. And she, of course, lost her head. Jane Seymour, probably his favorite wife, died 12 days after the birth of a boy child, Edward VI, who did survive. He didn't live to be very old, but he did survive. Took the throne at 9 with the help of his regent council, Uncle Edward Seymour. So portrait of Henry VIII is a lost work by Hans Holbein the Younger. The painting was destroyed by fire in 1698, but is very well known through many copies. This is perhaps the image that kind of sticks in our head when we think of Henry VIII. Anna of Cleves next. The marriage was annulled. Feelings were mutual, but I'll get to the backstory. Catherine Howard, briefly married before she was put to death for cheating on him. She was significantly younger and finds herself married to an older, sickly male. Catherine Parr, she was indeed the sixth wife. She actually outlived King Henry VIII. So Hans Holbein the Younger is essentially court painter to Henry VIII. He did a number of paintings for Henry VIII. So when we talk about Hans Holbein, they're generally referring to Hans Holbein the Younger. Hans Holbein the Elder was actually an artist as well, but he's not the one that's particularly famous. It's Hans Holbein the Younger that is more well known. Oil on panel, this was pretty common where they were actually painting oil on panel. It's 28 by 20 centimeters, so this is not huge at all. That centimeters are significantly smaller than an inch. This is sometimes referred to as the Thyssen Madrid portrait. So portraiture was the most popular genre in 16th century England, and particularly who was being painted were important personages, church leaders, popes, kings, for a long time, the top of the hierarchy was historical mythological works, and that was still true, but just under that was portraiture. That was very important as well. But again, the most popular genre in the 16th century is believed to be mostly portraiture. And they would hire these court painters to come in, and some of them spent years in the court producing paintings. Do I think that they idealized the features of their sitters? Absolutely. If there was a blemish or a scar or something like that, well, it was in their best interest to make these individuals look good. He's one of the few available artists following the schism between the Church of Rome and the Church of England, of which Henry VIII ultimately became the head. That was because the Pope in Rome wouldn't annul the first marriage of Catherine of Aragon. So he was unable to get that marriage annulled. Now, mind you, they'd been married well over 20 years. The Pope would not do it, so his solution, of course, was to create the Church of England. This likeness of the Tudor king is, again, really a strong example of Holbein's decorative style. He looks monumental. You can read so much into his character, his facial expression. Look at the way he painted that beard. And he's often wearing a lot of rings. He loved rings. He loved jewelry. That was very much a common denominator. One thing you should be looking at is sometimes the wives are shown with the same jewelry because, of course, after one wife goes, the next wife gets her jewelry. So I noticed as I was going through, really looking carefully at some of these works, it's like, wait, didn't I just see that? Yes, you probably did. But again, that would become the jewelry for the new queen. This is believed to be a self-portrait of Hans Holbein. There's not a lot of them. He also painted Thomas More. This is by Holbein. Thomas More was very, very respected. And as far as Hans Holbein, he was taught by his father. Again, he was an artist, a very strong, talented artist himself, just not nearly as famous as Hans Holbein the Younger. A member of the Artists Guild in 1519, traveled a great deal. He was recorded being in Italy, Lucerne, France, England, produced paintings, woodcuts, frescoes. Now the benefit of woodcuts is that these would be prints that would be reproduced, and so those would be well known. So if you have a painting per se of Henry VIII and then you produce a number of prints that are very similar, that's going to spread the imagery of the regal ruler more than anything else, really, is those woodcuts, those prints. Holbein goes to England in 1526. He was recommended by Thomas More, to Thomas More from the scholar and writer Erasmus. And Holbein dies of plague in London in 1543. And there were a number of waves of the plague. Holbein's half-portrait, this is one of few originals left. And so he uses this strong frontal pose. He's just slightly turned. Again, positions of his hands kind of shows his personality, his kind of majestic bearing. This does not look like a weak man. This looks like a determined individual. His gesture, his pose, his shoulders thrown back, it's very clear he's important. But the beard is what's remarkable, I think, in these particular paintings. 1540, Henry VIII. Again, they're just the jewels, and everything is really quite interesting. One thing I thought was interesting, it almost looks like he's wearing matching rings on both hands. So painted in the style of Hans Holbein, yet the face doesn't have anywhere near the detail that you get in a Hans Holbein. In 1536, he lost consciousness when a horse fell on him. Again, he was a serious sportsman. He loved to joust. Now, because he was the king, no one could really joust with him, but they would often like hold out this ring, and he would essentially, use that as a target. And he was unconscious for over 2 hours, and his personality changed. That's not uncommon with a brain injury, a significant brain injury. There are lots of written documents that support this claim, various sources. So traumatic brain imagery does change personality, and not for the better. Before this point, he was a fairly reasonable human being, it appears. But after that accident, he changed significantly. Here's some of the armor of King Henry VIII. And again, you can see he was not a small man. He was large. So field armor of Henry VIII, England, steel, blackened, etched, and gilt. The details are remarkable. And this is around 1544, and again, it's believed to be the armor of King Henry VIII. The second one is, again, probably the armor of Henry VIII, but we at least know that it's around the same time period, so we really get a sense for what the horses look like, the saddle looked like, the sort of armor they wore, which was very heavy. And then here's a detail of that work that is after Hans Holbein. Whereas I think most of the fabrication is pretty good, not nearly the same quality as you get with Hans Holbein. So this is believed to be Catherine of Aragon, and this is believed to be a young portrait of Henry VIII around the time of his first wedding. So he's a very young boy. Catherine of Aragon's marriage to the Tudor king lasted 24 years. Collectively, his other 5 marriages spanned only 14 years. She has long been overshadowed by her successors, particularly Anne Boleyn. I think most people know the name Anne Boleyn. So this is Michael Sittow portrait of Catherine dated around 1502. So Arthur, who was King Henry VIII's older brother, died shortly after his wedding to 16-year-old Catherine. This left her in a precarious position because she had not produced a male heir. They'd only been married a little while. Though Spain and England initially sought to maintain their alliance by marrying Catherine to another member of the Tudor family, there was discussion about both Henry VII, who's significantly older than her, or Henry VIII, who was younger. Negotiations were going back and forth. And ultimately, she spends around 7 years in this kind of, where are we going to put her? And she was part of negotiations between countries. So it was all very touchy. Henry VIII was not adverse to marrying Catherine of Aragon, even though we think it sounds pretty weird, marrying the widow of your brother. At least I think that sounds pretty weird. But it was not particularly weird in that time period, especially when it came to state marriages, which is essentially what this was, where you have these countries that are involved in negotiations. These are important marriages to connect, basically negotiate with each other. And so women and marriage was often used as a tool. So portrait of princess, again, I think most people think this is Catherine of Aragon. So she's the first wife of Henry VIII, and again was married briefly to Prince Arthur before. She is queen from 1509 to 1533, and she was well respected. So initially, Henry, again, desired her. He wished to marry her. That is pretty clear. She was older, but again, they got along well. He was familiar with her. Only after she did not produce a male heir, and she was getting too old to do so, did Henry VIII begin to think their union was essentially cursed. And so he really, really wanted a male heir. He thought somehow God is punishing me, so I need to get a new bride, because the problem is clearly that she basically was the wife of Arthur, and because of that union, God has not seen fit to bless him with a male heir. Okay, that was his convoluted reasoning. All right. So here we have Catherine of Aragon, a little older and a little older yet. So you can kind of have an idea of what she looked like in middle age. And so again, the jewelry is quite beautiful, and she was known to be very attractive. And she was from Spain. So Mary, this is a portrait of Mary the First, or Mary Tudor, daughter to Henry VIII, and she was a daughter of Catherine of Aragon. And so this was by Master John around 1540. Beautiful cobalt blue in the background. You have this orange gold, very decorative fabrication, and the complementary colors, very frontal pose, very formal, very dignified. They were very careful how they showed their image. These are large portraits generally, and it would be very, very important to present important, gracious, lovely image. And that becomes important later, as you'll see that sometimes you're made to look maybe a little prettier than you actually are. So Queen Mary I, this is a little roundel, watercolor on vellum around 1525. So Mary, after that marriage is declared annulled, essentially becomes illegitimate. So after the parents' divorce. So divorce / annulment again. But so by 1544, she was reinstated to the succession of the throne, but not for years. She was very much in limbo for a while. On the death of her half-brother Edward VI, she inherits the throne. There's a brief moment in time where another person took the throne, but I'll get to that. Anyway, a fervent Roman Catholic, she reintroduced the old religion. And religion very much is part of this. Catherine of Aragon was extremely Catholic, a devout Roman Catholic woman. And so for her husband to cast her aside because of religion and to embrace this new religion, this new Church of England, and to basically embrace Protestant, the Protestant faith was extremely mortifying for Catherine of Aragon. So here we have Queen Mary I, and this is by Antonis More. And so she looks formidable, doesn't she? She looks like one formidable woman. And it was not uncommon in this day and time for people to marry somebody based on a portrait. They would hear little things about the person, and then they would see a portrait, and then there would be messages back and forth between important countries, and they would negotiate marriage settlements. It sounds a little over the top for us today. So marriage to Philip II of Spain was actually desirable to her. She thought he looked really handsome. And when he met her, he was not so delighted. Again, but that didn't necessarily matter. You basically, when the negotiations were done between families, and that was what happened, then that was what you did. You could always take up on other people on the side, whatever, but these marriages of state were not uncommon. So she was very unhappy with Philip's absence abroad because she wanted to be around her new husband. And the loss of Calais in the war against France. This contributed to her final illness, according to some scholars, and this source is National Gallery. But I don't know, do they look like a match to you? I'm thinking not really. And again, he looks very like he's a sporting man. He looks rather athletic. He's handsome. He's determined. She looks very formidable, very, very formal, rather stiff. But in any case, she does exemplify rulership, though, and that becomes important too. It's important that she looks distinguished, in charge, and he, of course, is consort to her. So here we have Cardinal Wolsey, and I also have Catherine of Aragon. Let me show you why. So Henry VIII's very powerful churchman in England, Wolsey, or Cardinal Wolsey, was divisive. He had many critics, and the criticism, of course, went on for many years after his death. After the English Reformation, he becomes a symbol of everything wrong with the medieval church. Greedy, corrupt, self-serving, with no interest in caring for the souls it was meant to save. His fat body, which proved to the world that he was gluttonous and self-indulgent, showed his deeper and more damaging flaws. Now, interestingly enough, they've done some research and they've wondered if he was actually fat. And they think that maybe it was the iconography, signs and symbols in art, iconography, to show him as this gluttonous presence, that he may not have even looked like this, that any weight that he had may have been enhanced. So art used as propaganda? Absolutely, especially during this time period. So this is Lord High Chancellor of England, portrait of Cardinal Wolsey. So he falls out of favor when he failed to get married, when he failed to get the marriage of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII annulled, okay? Which that was a tough thing to do, period. So this is the trial of Queen Catherine of Aragon by Henry Nelson O'Neill, 19th century. So this is a couple centuries later. This is as somebody imagined this might have been, but it's based on stories and accounts where Catherine of Aragon did indeed beg for Henry VIII to not do this. And so, and it shows this moment, and it shows the cardinals, and it shows the king kind of, you know, looking away, but not looking at her. I thought I'd show you a few images of Hans Holbein. This is the artist family. This is his family. And the realism in this is amazing. And you don't have all of the jewels. It's very down to earth. You definitely see an average family. So limited palette. He did not idealize his family in any way, shape, or form like he did the royals. I mean, very, very naturalized. So he returns to Basel in the summer of 1528, purchases a house, completes a mural, revises an altarpiece. So he was very well regarded and he had plenty of work. He also painted this portrait and one of his two eldest children. And so it's been described as it being imbued with a haunting sadness, and that may have been influenced by the paintings of Leonardo the Great that he would have seen. And so there's some thought that that's why they have this kind of somber, contemplative look to them. So yes, at a glance, some Leonardos are sad and introspective, maybe have a soft smile, but not a joyous smile in generally. Maybe the portrait there of John the Baptist in the top corner, the second one, has maybe a little bit more of a smirk than you usually get. But overall, yes, I would agree that a lot of Leonardo da Vinci's works show a very sad, more introspective expression. These screenshots are usually when I do a Google search of a very specific subject matter. Sad portraits of Leonardo da Vinci. And I think at a glance it's kind of easier to just kind of get an idea of the artisans or the major artist work, more so than if I showed you a bunch of slides. details are amazing in it. Hans Holbein the Younger, Dead Christ in the Grave. I mean, the naturalism in this are incredible. Uh, the Christ figure, of course, looks emaciated. You have sense of rigidity. You have kind of grayish skin. You can see the wounds of Christ. His face looks very, very angular, sunken in. It's disturbing. One of the more disturbing images of Christ, I think. And then here's a detail of it so you can really get the full idea. The idea being that by getting all of this naturalism, all of this detail, is that it would bring the viewer in to a more empathetic connection with Christ. And again, this was very, very, they were very, very careful about this. You didn't want the picture to be so realistic that people were worshiping it, but you did want it to inspire empathy or sympathy in the event. This large-scale work with two full-size figures was something that was unusual for Holbein. And it is called The Ambassadors, 1533. 1533 is right about that time period where Anne Boleyn is entering the picture. He's trying to marry Anne Boleyn. You're starting to see a fracture of England with the Roman Catholic Church. You're also starting to see England pulling away from Spain by rejecting Catherine of Aragon. So there's some political ramifications of his desire to marry Anne Boleyn. And the first figure is Jean de Dinteville, and he is wearing a lynx-edged jacket with this rich fabrication. He's got kind of an artistic hat on, and he has a little hat badge or brooch up on his hat that's actually a small skull. This was a memento mori, a reminder of death. There's also a memento mori on the bottom. Tilt your head, kind of see that weird shape. It's a skull. And it's one of those mysteries in art history as to why he put it so prominently in the middle. But it's a reminder of death. Death was never very far away in the 16th century. You had plague, you had war, you had beheadings. We're talking about a lot of beheadings today. And so Jean de Dinteville is actually also the one that commissioned this work. And he commissioned it for his French palace, Police. And the other figure is Georges de Salve. And Georges de Salve is also an ambassador. And he's also wearing rich fabrications, but not nearly as flamboyant and bold as the first one. In fact, it's said by some scholars and art historians that this particular figure of Jean de Dinteville may be the inspiration for the later images of Henry VIII, who saw this and thought, well, this is pretty fabulous. Look how important he looks. Look at the rich fabrications. And his is even more over the top. Henry VIII's are even more over the top. So we even know the age of these two gentlemen. Frankly, when I first saw this work, I almost thought they were twins. They look so much alike, but no. They're two types maybe, or two individuals that happen to resemble each other, but they look a lot alike. One is holding an actual dagger that's in a scabbard, and it's actually dated, or it actually has 29 written. It's believed to be how old Jean de Seville, the ambassador, Jean de Dinteville, the ambassador, actually was. The other one he's actually leaning on a book that has the number 25. So they think that represents his age. I think they look older, but mind you, people would have looked older then. Times were a lot tougher. The background used to be much more dark after cleaning and after restoration. That bright, vivid green comes up. What else do I need to talk about? Oh, the lute. The lute is across a book. The book is just tucked under it. The book is a hymn of by Martin Luther. So this is a symbol of the Protestant Reformation. And on top of it is a lute. It's got a broken thread, and it's believed to symbolize the broken aspect of the Roman Catholic Church. So this is actually a painting that is symbolically showing the schism that is occurring in the church. On the top, you have the more worldly view. Literally, you have a globe. The globe is on an unusually skewed, and that is particularly believed to be to suggest that the world was unstable. The world, it was off its axis to a certain degree. And so there's all these little details. The exotic carpet that is covering the table, these exotic carpets were Turkish. They were produced in the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't uncommon for them to be used on a table. They were extremely valuable, hand done. And then the floor that they're standing on is Westminster Abbey. It is recognizable as the floor that's in Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey, this flooring is actually believed to represent the world, the cosmic world, the universe. And there they are, these ambassadors. Now, Jean de Dinteville actually went to be ambassador into England 5 different times. This is said to be his 2nd time. Now, they did not even know who these people were until the 1900s. The historian Mary Harvey was said to have done a lot of the research to figure out what these things meant. And again, I'll probably have a little clip or something that explains each thing, but it's a little long, so if you don't want to watch it all, that's fine. But there are so many details in this, so many. But again, I think one of the most influential things about this is the fact that it's more than likely Henry VIII was so impressed with the look of this ambassador that he wanted something equally lavish. And I think he got something more so. So 1533, here's a frontal view of it. You can see a lot of the details. And again, I will give you a clip that goes through everything. But that memento mori, that skull that's stretched all across the foreground, you have to get and kind of lean to the side to even see it. It's just a puzzling thing in art history as to why he did that. It's so abstracted, it's so different, it's so modern, really. So Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn's family was pretty powerful, and they were pushing forward this match. Anne Boleyn's sister had been a mistress to the king. Indeed, it has been suggested strongly that she likely produced a child that was male, but he would not have been able to take the throne because he was illegitimate. So already they had a tie-in with Anne Boleyn, so that was her sister. And it's said that Anne Boleyn was very, very careful not to become his mistress. She learned a little bit from her sister, and until it was a situation that where she could become queen, she really wasn't interested in following through. So she flirted, and she compelled him to wait, and he was enthralled with her. And again, he thought this union would be blessed, and this union will produce male children. Now, of course, we know that it's the male that basically determines the sex of the child, not the female, but they didn't know that back then, unfortunately. But unfortunately for Anne Boleyn. So these indeed are some images of Anne Boleyn there. So the Book of Hours of Anne Boleyn. And so the Book of Hours of Anne Boleyn was actually said to have been carried by her when she was beheaded. The Book of Hours previously belonged to Queen Catherine of Aragon. So recently, scholars have actually examined it and found that there are additional words in there that they did not know were written. Now, a Book of Hours is kind of a calendar, but it's more importantly, it's a sacred book. It's a book of contemplation. They're hand done, they're hand painted. They would have been produced in a monastery often, or in the monastery there would be what's called a scriptorium, which was a place where they would actually spend days just writing and illustrating, basically painting and illustrating, drawing these very detailed works. These were priceless. They were extraordinarily expensive. You had even one book in this time period, you were wealthy. A book of this magnitude, a Book of Hours like this, might have been produced in the lifetime of one monk, one scribe. So really, really wild. And they're so beautiful. You have these initial pages, you have this large initial page that begins it, and they often tell the story of the Nativity, the story of Mary, and sometimes it's affiliated with a saint, especially if you're named after a saint, then they would have a Book of Hours that was dedicated to that saint. So these Book of Hours were something that was very valuable. They think that more than likely this Book of Hours was something she carried and probably handed off to one of her ladies in waiting or somebody that was present at the beheading, sadly. So again, historian has discovered secret messages. I don't know, I think that's stating it because although we don't really know what it means, revealing that the book was passed down among women who risked discovery by the king for owning something associated with a condemned traitor. And so in it, there are names, there is information that they did not see until centuries later. So a few names, and it's been passed down in the Boleyn family for generations. She was a religious woman, but did not always agree with Henry. Sometimes she was very vocal in her disagreement with Henry, and I think over time that probably didn't do well for her. Scholars know of one inscription in the book in Boleyn's hand that she wrote, "Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day." She had had some failed pregnancies. She had a stillbirth, and again, she was not a weak woman, a strong woman, and so consequently, he turned from her pretty quickly, and he basically accused her of cheating on him and cheating on him with her brother, and all sorts of things were laid at her door, which now they believe were not true. They do think she was very much a victim in all of this. But of course, she was a scapegoat. She didn't produce the heir that he wanted, and she did produce a daughter, and that was Elizabeth. And of course, Elizabeth becomes important later. But she did not produce that much desired male heir. And so, of course, she's the first to lose her head. And so these are some sketches of Anne Boleyn. They think that there were probably more, but probably many were destroyed because she, of course, was basically made a traitor. Went through a kind of kangaroo court or whatever, but in any case. She was very pretty, but certainly I think a lot of us have this image that she must have been breathtakingly gorgeous. But I think she had a certain charm, I think she had a certain charisma, and I think she definitely compelled him to care for her. This is a late Elizabethan portrait of Anne Boleyn around 1530. And here you actually have the B for Boleyn on her necklace. And again, the pearls, and pearls, of course, were a symbol, were a luxury and also purity. Margaret Lee, a lady in waiting to Anne Boleyn. She's a friend to Anne Boleyn and may have been present at her execution. Many of her ladies in waiting went on to serve the next queen, Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was the lady in waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon and also to Anne Boleyn. So a lady in waiting would have been, she's not a servant. This is a real honor. These are ladies of the court, but they would basically spend time with the queen. They might do sewing with her. They might ride with her. What other things might they do? Attend court activities. So these would have been women that would have been friends to the queen. And then they would also have servants that would actually dress all of them. So these were ladies of importance. Ladies in waiting, it was quite the honor. So Mary Boleyn, this is believed to be a portrait of Mary Boleyn, who was her sister. Again, scholars argue about whether she bore the king an illegitimate child, probably a boy, but her son was noted to look like Henry, and he did not acknowledge the child because, again, he was seeking an annulment from Catherine and trying to marry her sister. So the last thing he should be doing was something that could be perceived as immoral. So that was something that was kind of downplayed. At least that's the belief of many. Henry Carey, this is an older picture of the child of Mary Boleyn and possibly Henry VIII. So this is in a private collection in 1560s. So again, he would have been in his 30s when this was produced. Thomas Cromwell, Earl of Essex. This was not done by Holbein. It's done after Hans Holbein the Younger, which means, again, they are inspired by the style of Hans Holbein the Younger, and so named after Hans Holbein the Younger. It's oil on panel, early 17th century, and it's based on a work of from the 1530s. Rather unflattering portrait of this ambitious man. He looks powerful, he looks ruthless, and there's the same colors we keep seeing over and over again, these jewel tones, that exotic Turkish rug on the side, and then of course the wall hanging behind is really rich and beautiful. So lawyer, statesman, first Earl, disliked by the Boleyn family, too much power. He's the one that is believed to have circulated rumors about Anne Boleyn. In fact, later, much later, he is said to have confessed that they were untrue. Of course, it was too late for Anne Boleyn, but it was in pursuit of power, like a lot of things in politics, about power. The again, the details of this is remarkable. This is not Hans Holbein, though. This is after Hans Holbein in the style of. So, chiefly responsible for the Reformation in England, for the dissolution of the monasteries, let me explain that in a moment, and for strengthening the royal administration. He was eventually arrested for heresy and treason and executed. So a lot of the people in King Henry VIII's court didn't fare very well. Henry VIII is said to have later regretted it. The king had quite the temper, and he also regretted the killing Thomas More, his friend, but I'll get to that as well. But as far as the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry VIII was finding himself short of money, and this minister basically gave him a solution. Well, we can dissolve the monasteries, and that would be a huge savings of money, and the monies that are in the monastery, any of those monies would come into your treasury. And so essentially they were shutting down those monasteries, and of course that would also lead to the dissolution of the power of the Roman Catholic Church, because the monasteries had a certain amount of power as well. British school, 16th century. Several artists produced this work. It's called The Field of Cloth and Gold, 1540s, a summit meeting between the French and English. Did not go particularly well because they hated each other. They were warring with each other. And it was a way of negotiating. Fountains had ale and wine and dragon, fireworks, very, very lavish display. And again, the detail is just remarkable in this. And both sides, of course, were trying to show their power and their wealth, and they were trying to make it look very, very impressive. So this is a pretty famous work of this time period from the British school. Again, several artists produced it. Hans Holbein, Sir Thomas More, 16th century, successor to Wolsey. He was a friend with Henry VIII since they were young children. This was a very good friend. He could talk to Henry VIII about anything. But you'll remember his personality changed pretty dramatically after that fall from a horse. So they could debate and were good friends until religion ultimately separated them. And Henry wanted his way. Henry wanted to separate from the church so that he could get a new bride, so that he could get a new heir. And essentially he asked Sir Thomas More to basically say that it was okay to turn away from the Roman Catholic Church. It was he needed him to sanctify his union with his new bride, and Thomas More said no. He was unable to do that. It was against his faith. He was not willing to say something that wasn't true, and so he did indeed order his death as well. This was a very powerful man as well. Sir Thomas More, an important writer as well. His father, his household, his descendants by Roland Locke. After Hans Holbein the Younger, again, inspired by, or again, you're seeing some of the same colors, some of the same styles, but this is much later, 1590s. 89 by 130. This is the National Portrait Gallery in the UK. And so it's showing the importance of the More family and all the details and the dress, and the ladies with their prayer books and the men with their prayer books. This was very much showing the importance of religion. So over 5 generations of the More family and their family crest are shown here. And you could see this is a very religious family, a very formal family, a very educated family. Again, the details and the symbols of the lilies in the background for purity, and it's a lovely family portrait, especially representing this time period. Holbein, portrait of Erasmus of Rotterdam. He did a few of them. Erasmus, of course, is one of the people that recommended him, and also Thomas More. And so he was able to get into this court, and it was a very important position. And he stayed in the good graces of King Henry VIII the entire time, although there were times when he wasn't entirely delighted with him, but we'll get there. So, with letter in hand from the humanist scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, Holbein first approached Sir Thomas More. The artist executed a number of portraits for More and others of standing before returning to the continent in 1528. 4 years later, Holbein was back in England. Shortly, he found himself in the court of Henry VIII. One of the reasons why he ends up leaving Germany is because there was a Reformation happening. There wasn't a lot of a need for artists painting church portraits, and so he finds himself in a situation where they were interested in these lavish portraits, and so it becomes money for him. This is Jane Seymour, and Jane Seymour is probably the most beloved of Henry VIII's wives, mainly, I think, because she was pretty passive, sweet, very much went along with whatever Henry VIII wanted. Of course, her predecessor lost her head, so that might be part of it. But Lady Jane Seymour was definitely a favorite. She was known to be quite beautiful, and she unfortunately dies shortly after she produces the much anticipated heir, which was Edward. So, third wife of Henry VIII, so we're on number 3, workshop of Hans Holbein, and then you can see it restored. Restoration work, that's a whole nother subject. But people have to be very, very talented and very, very careful, and it's very, very time consuming, and they're often just using cotton swabs and trying to get the varnish off, and they're sometimes using, they're trying to find paint that replicates the paint of the period. Restoration work is a really interesting subject in itself. I think the king is but a man, as I am. The violet smells to him as it doth to me. This is a quote from Henry VIII, which basically, I'm just a regular guy. But I don't think he truly believed that. So, paraphrased, I'm a man and a king, and I like sweet-smelling young things. So, yeah, I took some liberties there. So, again, this is Jane Seymour, third wife, and died of natural causes. Again, a few, not very long after she produced the heir. And it wasn't uncommon for women to die in childbirth, after childbirth, infection. They didn't have a really good understanding that it's a good idea to wash your hands. Sanitary conditions were awful. If someone was sick, bloodletting was something that was still done. And so here you also are seeing her in these beautiful detailed jewels, and of course the dress of the time period. I think the king is but a man, as I am. The violet smells to him as it doth to me. Famously stated by King Henry VIII. I'm going to paraphrase really, really broadly. I'm a man and a king, just like any man, and I like sweet smelling young things. Okay, so this is the third wife of King Henry VIII. Again, I think she was kind of known to have been one of the more beautiful, but they were all pretty. And she, with one possible exception, and she died of natural causes related to childbirth. Not uncommon in this time period. Women would get infections. Midwives, doctors didn't always wash their hands. Midwives did more than doctors, however. And so this idea of sanitary conditions, again, for a variety of reasons, women didn't often survive, and it was not uncommon for a woman to die in childbirth. But she did die after she produced the much desired Edward. So this is the Whitehall mural. This shows his parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. These were the parents of King Henry VIII, and Jane Seymour. And it was commissioned by Henry VIII. Look how larger than life he looks. He looks certainly more important than his father. Monument basically says that Henry VII was a great king, but Henry VIII was greater still in size, in personality, everything really. And then, of course, they're standing on these rich tapestries as well. And so this is the Whitehall mural. So we know of the Whitehall mural from a painted copy because it's no longer extant. So there was a fire at Whitehall. And so this copy is much smaller than the original, but at least it gives us an idea of what the Whitehall mural, the Holbein Whitehall mural looked like. We do have extant, I think this one's at the National Gallery, is a Holbein sketch that shows, of course, Henry VIII. So you see Henry VIII here, again, in all his importance. And, very, very broad. Again, think back to that ambassador portrait. This is a watercolor for the palace at Whitehall. And it's basically the propaganda behind it is emphasizing his right to the throne by emphasizing his line. Henry VII, Elizabeth of York. Henry was only the second Tudor king, and his position was rather insecure. So Holbein is basically putting forward his claim, his position, his confidence. And again, when he started, I think when he started his reign, there was a great deal of anticipation and happiness about it. It was just shortly after that that he wasn't nearly so popular, not at all. So Elizabeth of York was from the rival Yorkist line and presenting him as the uniter of these two dynasties. And so Henry's wife here, Jane Seymour, is believed to have been pregnant at this point with Edward VI. And so and so here you actually have a portrait of King Henry VIII, and you have next to him Edward VI. You have next to him Jane Seymour. The colors are all warm tones and rich reds and golds, very, very regal. And this is an interesting quote from Naomi Close, PhD. Contrary to popular view, this desire for a male offspring was not only a reflection of the king's ego, but grounded in contemporary political reality. This is true. I mean, they needed this for stability. The birth of a son would reduce the risk of civil war, which might be caused by the selection of a non-filial or illegitimate male, or a fight for the throne, divisions that would occur, or of the passing of control of England itself to another power. And then here's a portrait of Edward VI as an infant. And I was reading and watching a lot of documentaries. And Edward VI has always been presented as being very, very sickly. And new research is suggesting that that may not be true. Certainly in this particular portrait, he looks very, very healthy. So this is the workshop of Hans Holbein the Younger. These would have been people that were studying under him, working under him, certainly working on some of the details maybe he didn't want to work on. And so this is a work that's in Rome, in Italy. It's large, 225 inches by 189 inches. And so, again, you cannot underestimate the importance of these portraits to show his power, his prestige, his wealth, and he's larger than life, and certainly he looks imposing. There is a strong sense of power. He does not look like a weak man. Doesn't have a weak chin. He just looks very, very direct, imposing. It looks like someone you don't want to mess with for a lot of reasons. Edward VI, and this is portrait is from the Circle of William Scrott's 1550s, so done some years later. So Edward VI died in 1553, and again, this portrait would have been most likely have been done from other works as inspiration. So he was Henry VIII's only legitimate son. His mother, Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, died 12 days after his birth. And it's said that Edward VIII was deeply depressed about it. He was excited about his son, but he was deeply upset about the death of his wife, Jane Seymour. He felt very cheated by God. And so, again, now they think that he wasn't as sickly as history has portrayed him, and he was very smart. He knew Greek, Latin, very intelligent, and during Edward's reign, the Church of England became more explicitly Protestant. Book of Common Prayer was introduced, and so it was emphasized over Catholicism. This is a portrait of an illegitimate child of Henry VIII, and this was not by Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister. This was by Elizabeth Blount, again another mistress of the king, which it was common, they did that. And so he's believed to have lived to 17. Life expectancy back then was. So Henry VIII needed another bride because he needed another legitimate son. He needed an heir and a spare. And so a search begins for a new queen. One of the things that was commonly done was that court artists would go to other places. They would travel. Holbein traveled a great deal, and Holbein traveled and did paintings. He could do them in a few days of women that could possibly become the next queen. And so one of the portraits that he did was Anna of Cleves. And so again, they were negotiating with different countries, different positions. Basically everyone was trying to get the situation where they could have a link with England that would be politically savvy. And so Anna of Cleves is one that is put forward, and he loves her portrait. Then he meets her, and he thought she was unattractive. But at that point in time, the marriage contracts had already been negotiated. It was pretty much a done deal. So she did not look like the painting that he fell in love with. So she ultimately survives Henry VIII and was actually on pretty good terms with him because basically they were able to get the marriage annulled. So whether or not it indeed was consummated is interesting to know, but again, it was annulled. And she actually stayed on fairly good terms with him and died before her 42nd birthday, probably of cancer, which has been suggested. But you wonder, was he annoyed with Holbein? And like the relationship that we know of that he had with Holbein was positive for the most part. So you would have thought that it would have been more problematic, but apparently not, because he continues to be a court painter for the artist. But I'm sure that he probably had to do a little bit of swift talking, but who knows? So it was a political marriage. He wanted another son. Supposedly it was not consummated because he thought she smelled. And she did receive a nice settlement and a home and stayed in England and ultimately becomes a friend of the court as well. And a woman of some means and again was able to live independently, which is remarkable in this time period. So she kind of sort of had a happy ending with the possible exception of only living to 42. So here's a print, Henry VIII views a painting of Anne of Cleves, but this print was produced in 1781, so much later, much later. So another image of Anne of Cleves. Doesn't look unattractive, but again, apparently she had some scarring on her face from smallpox. This one is one that was also created later, and in this particular print, she doesn't look quite nearly as attractive. But knowing the history is probably why they changed that a little bit. And so Burlington Magazine also produced this image, which is really quite wonderful. And this is attributed to Barthel Brun, and it's oil on vellum, and it was sold at Christie's, but the present whereabouts is unknown. Sometimes works pass into private collections. Maybe they pass into a few private collections and people lose track of them. So it could crop up. So whether Brun painted it or not, it is possible this is a portrait of a pair shown in the spring of 1539. So this would have been something that would have been produced fairly quickly. Again, they needed to be able to do it quickly. So Anna of Cleves gets her own place, moves out. There's a new vacancy. And next we have another Catherine, Catherine Howard. Now I want you to note, sometimes different sources spell Catherine with a K or Catherine with a C. I went with the ones that were most common. So if several sources went with the C for Catherine, that's what I used. He marries indeed 3 of the 6 brides were Catherines, just to make it confusing. This is a portrait of Catherine Howard, 1540, and she was charged with adultery in 1541 and executed in February 1542. And unlike Anne Boleyn, who we think was innocent of adulterous behavior with more than one person, this young woman is believed to have been adulterous. So not that she deserves being beheaded, but it did happen back then. So he was 49 and she was 16, 17 years old when they were married. She was a queen for a mere 16 months. She was beheaded on the grounds of treason for committing adultery with one of the male courtiers, Thomas Culpeper. And so she was a lady in waiting to Anna of Cleves. So these ladies in waiting, especially if they were attractive, were in a very good place to be seen by the king at dances, at gatherings, at any sort of court, garden party, anything. In any case, that often did happen. They would catch the attention of the king. So you could see that being a lady in waiting was a kind of a powerful place to be, at least for this particular court. So here we have a print, but this one's much later, 1660s, and Hans Holbein's portrait's probably more accurate. So we have two different images of Catherine Howard, but one's a generation later. So I think you could probably, it suggests that this particular one by Hans Holbein is probably more accurate. So an attractive young woman as well, but very young. The rings, again, look all very similar. Often just kind of a black ring, and again, the jewelry sometimes looks very similar. So of all losses, time is the most irrecoverable, for it cannot never be redeemed. So he dies in Whitehall Palace in London. From natural causes. His health was very poor. He was very obese. His leg wound from jousting had never even healed. It became ulcerated, gout, diabetes. Hard to know exactly, but for years they treated it, and they treated it in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes it looked like a form of torture. And this open wound often was infected, often smelled. He was known to have often had quite the smell about him. That was pretty well documented. Christina of Denmark is one that he becomes interested in having her as a bride. And by this point in time, you have a king that is known to have beheaded two of his wives, and consequently, she was really not interested in the position. She had no desire whatsoever to be the new wife of King Henry VIII. Christina of Denmark had more than one proposal, and again, she was able to say no. Good decision. She's actually quite young in this. She supposedly is around 16 years old. I think she looks older, maybe because of that rather imposing garb that she's wearing. Here she is shown as a widow. She's the widowed Duchess of Milan here. So Holbein had been sent by Henry VIII to capture her likeness, while Henry's ambassador floated the idea of marriage. She is reported to have succinctly responded, if I had two heads, one should be at the King of England's disposal. No. And it also should be noted that she was the great niece of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. He's getting older at this point, late 40s, early 50s, and she was not interested. The details in this are really quite lovely. I loved the hand details. Many of you know I have a thing for hands, and these are particularly well done. So, but he would have done this remarkably quick. This would have been done in days. I think it's one of the more striking portraits, and it's full length, which is interesting as well. This print is much later, 1680s, but she would have been older. And so we see an image of her older, and actually is pretty closely related. Catherine Parr, we are to number 6 now. I should have big numbers on the corner, shouldn't I? And so Catherine Parr is sometimes spelled with an E, sometimes it's just P-A-R-R. More commonly, that's what I saw, so that's what I used. And so Catherine Parr, also very, very beautiful, appealing. And she's shown here dressed really, really lovely. This is a detail of her work. Here you can see the half portrait. So she survives Henry, barely. He did get annoyed with her at one point in time, and she did have to seek forgiveness. So Anna Cleves is one that survives and was the last of his queens to die. Catherine Parr marries Henry on July 12, 1543, and she outlives him by only 1 year. Fun fact, she was the most married English queen with 4 husbands. So this is Catherine Parr. As far as she dies not too long after Henry VIII. Her body resides at St. Mary's Chapel in Sudley Castle. This is an effigy, a memorial, a tomb, a sarcophagi that is dated 19th century. But again, she died in 1548. Her remains suffered some various indignities in the 18th century where they were moved. But now she's again in this rather fine alabaster memorial. She had a girl with her 4th husband, Thomas Seymour. Thomas Seymour had been someone she had loved before she married Henry VIII, but it was politically expedient for her to become the queen and to accept Henry VIII. So ultimately, she does marry Thomas Seymour. She has a child with him. They name her Mary Seymour, and she's named after Catherine of Aragon. Do you think sometimes you have to write all this out in order to keep track of all this? So unfortunately, her daughter dies at only 2 years old, and the mother died of childbed fever. So she doesn't live too much longer after King Henry VIII, and only briefly lives with her 4th husband, Thomas Seymour, and then ultimately, again, they lose that child, Mary Seymour. But it wasn't uncommon to lose small children. The death rate was over 50%. St. Mary's Chapel at Sudley Castle in England. So she was extremely smart. Catherine Parr was a scholar. She wrote 3 books, Prayers, Meditations, The Lamentations of a Sinner, Psalms and Prayers, first queen to have her works published. She had religious differences with Henry. Indeed, she was going to be arrested. She pled her case, and he forgave her and died shortly after. As stated, she loved Thomas Seymour before, but did not marry him. She was known to have been a good stepmother, and this becomes important because she unites the family, at least as much as she could. This was a pretty highly dysfunctional family. She married Seymour 6 months after his death, and many portraits of the royals are because Catherine Parr is the one that encouraged it. So here we have the king celebrating the act of union between the Company of Barbers and the Guild and Fellowship of Surgeons in 1540. He looks like a superhero or something. He's larger than life. He's in brilliant color, whereas all the other ones have their names labeled, their faces are discernible, but they might as well be cut from a cookie cutter. he definitely is the most important figure in this work, and with his sword and his stance and his level of importance here. So to Henry VIII, best and greatest King of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith and supreme head of the church, the company of surgeons vows to consecrate these lines. Slightly paraphrased. Sadder than ever, the plague profaned the land of the English, harassing men's minds and besetting their bodies, bade thee undertake the office of good physician. He becomes the good physician. The light of gospel flies around thee on glowing winds that will remedy a mind diseased, and by counsel men steady, and every disease is expelled by speedy aid. Mindful of the gift which thou, O Henry, hast blessed us, we wish blessings on thy rule. Wow. So this was commissioned. This was a royal grant, and so these healers, essentially, this barber's company, this is basically a thank you note about it. So this is a very late portrait of Henry VIII. He's only 55. 9-year-old son succeeds him, but he dies 6 years later. Catherine Parr had urged him to write a will acknowledging Mary and Elizabeth. Remember, Elizabeth had been and Mary both had been basically deemed illegitimate since his marriage ended with their mothers. So in any case, they become part of the succession. Right before that happens, Lady Jane Grey becomes the 9-day queen. It's a kind of convoluted story, so I'm not going to go into it. But again, right after that, we have a Mary, and then we later have Queen Elizabeth, who reigned for a long time. So the story is pretty compelling. It's just one of those stories I thought was fascinating. So he dies in 1557. Again, his health had never really been right since after the jousting accident and the fall from that horse, where the horse apparently landed on him, and he suffered head injury and leg injury. So leg pain lasted him his whole life. Personality problems lasted him his whole life, and there was an awful stench about him, probably gangrene, complications of diabetes perhaps. He was a very large man, but death at 55 was not highly unusual. Life expectancy was significantly less. So I hope you enjoyed kind of learning about the reign of Henry VIII. Again, I studied it at UCI, and I had a professor that absolutely was fascinating to listen to. He loved Henry VIII. So this is Henry VIII in pictures. So thank you.